Welcome to Insights in Sound, where we talk to the people behind the scenes, behind the technology, and behind the music. People you may not know, but you should.
My guest today is engineer-producer John Neff. John's had about a 50 some odd year career in being a musician, engineer, film scoring, studio design, all over the map like many of us. And let's just start with some kind of early background. I assume you started as a musician like most of us did, right?
Yes, I started playing guitar in 1961, and I joined a band in 1963. I made my first record in 1965 at the age of 14.
Wow.
And
Okay.
made another one in 1968 with Mylan Bogdan as my engineer.
So let's talk a little bit about that, because one of the things that always fascinates me is how, as the technology evolved, the creative process was changed, and you started really early on. Now, I started in the days of 2-inch tape. And so you had multi-track, you had the ability to overdub. When you went into the studio in the early 60s, there wasn't even really that option that much, was there?
No, the Ascot's record, So Good, which is a cult classic today. That was my 1965 record. You can find it on YouTube. We recorded in a studio called Sounds Unlimited in Washington Township, Michigan. The guy had an 8-channel homemade tube console, a half-inch 3-track Ampex, and we recorded the whole band to one track, the vocals to another track, and the background vocals and lead to the third track. And it was mixed to glorious mono.
Of course it was. Yeah. Well, and that always fascinates me, because you start to think about how the evolution, how it evolved to 4 tracks and to 8 tracks and so on and so forth. And to a certain extent, one of the things that's always fascinated me is how the more technology advanced, the more stymied we got in certain ways, because there was that paralysis of too many options where you had 24 tracks. Oh, we've got to fill them all. And then there was the undo key, and the ability to try something over and over again until you got it right without worrying about accidentally punching in on something or slicing it with a razor blade.
Yeah.
So how, I mean, obviously for you were involved in this first and foremost as an artist, but at what point did you start getting into the technology aspect of it?
On the recording of the Ascot's record in August of 1965. I expected that, I was 14 years old. I expected that we would all gather around one mic like I had seen the Beach Boys singing into, and he'd just hit go. But he used all 8 channels to mic up the band, and then printed it in mono to one track on the machine. But he was able to balance the band on the rotary faders. And I followed him around while he was setting the microphones, and I was just amazed that there was a mic on every amp and 3 mics on the drums. And so I started asking a lot of questions, and he was really helpful and friendly, and that piqued my interest, and I started really paying attention to the studio after that. When we made our 1968 record, Maple Street Park by the Tribe, with Mylan Engineering, we were at Terra Sherma Studios in Detroit, and they had an 8-track. So we really used all 8 tracks. And
that's a world of options right there at that point, right?
Yeah, it was wonderful.
Yeah, I think I watched the evolution of not only the technology in terms of recording, but the console technology.
Oh yeah.
And that was fascinating for me as well. One of the early sessions that I had done was I was working with a band, and I met a gentleman who has long since passed, an engineer I worked with on many projects named David Vaught. And Dave had an original Flickinger console.
Oh, I worked on one of those at United Sound in Detroit in 1971.
And I was fascinated by the whole concept of, wow, it's a 5-bus console. That's kind of odd,
Yeah, this one was an 8-bus Flickinger, and I mixed the Toad and the Mushroom album on it.
Oh, I love it. And so for you, in terms of watching that happen and also being involved, at what point did you start really transitioning into becoming someone behind the glass as opposed to being a player? Because there's the whole left brain, right brain thing there, and a lot of people never make that transition, don't want to make that transition. Obviously, you were drawn to it. At what point did you start crossing that chasm, so to speak?
On the Toad and the Mushroom album, I became the producer of it, and we recorded to a 4-track 3M M56 machine, and I wanted the drums in stereo. So I had the drummer play half the kit on one pass and half the kit on another pass, and I had stereo drums because I bust out, and this was before the pan pot, so I bust out hard left and right on those drums, and we used overdubbing and mixing down and sound on sound on that album. We used that 4-track to death.
I'll bet.
And, I had an engineer named Frank Merwin, and he taught me so much about recording that I decided that was the path I wanted, but it wasn't to be for a number of years. In 1971, I got a job as the rhythm section session guitarist at United Sound Systems in Detroit under producer Don Davis. Now, Don had been at Motown in the golden years, and he quit when he never got paid by Barry. And he went to Stax in '65 and was there producing for all the golden era of Stax. Then he bought United Sound in Detroit and came home, and he had a house band at Motown and a house band at Stax. So he wanted a house band at United Sound. And he put together 6 of us, and I was the only white guy in the section, and playing guitar. And now he had a 16-track, and we made about 125 soul records between 1971 and 1973. And that was my college education in the studio.
That was a golden era for soul records too.
Oh yeah, I played on I Can See Clearly Now and Me and Mrs. Jones.
Wow. So at that point, you're working in the studio as a player. Are you fascinated / frustrated by not being able to be more involved in the other side of the glass, creative process?
Yes, as a session player, I was a little frustrated because I loved the recording process so much that I wanted to be more involved in what went on in the control room, but that was forbidden territory to us session players.
Right. You didn't even walk in there unless you were invited, basically.
I did walk in there a couple of times and got small reel-to-reel copies of some of our sessions. And because the engineer was a friend of mine, I had worked with him when I mixed the Toad and the Mushroom album there earlier. So he knew me. Mm-hmm. And but during the sessions themselves, no, we stayed in the playing room.
I can imagine. So at what point did you actually take up engineering? And was it a gradual transition from one side to the other, or did you just decide?
It was gradual. I made the transition at Pantheon Studios in Scottsdale, Arizona in 1977. I started running sessions, and I had an assistant that knew the console. So I produced an album called Sun Devil there. That was my first engineering job. And it came out fine. We had a 16-track Scully. And that was my shift. And I produced another couple of albums there. One, I can't remember the artist's name now. I just took his 45 down off the wall. I'm retiring. But for Desert City Records, I produced an album for Joel. I forget his last name. And we had a single off of it that got airplay. And I was so thrilled to hear that record on the air.
That's always a great feeling the first time you hear your music on the air, isn't it?
Yes.
I know that excited the hell out of me the first time I did. And I didn't even realize it was us at first. It was my band. And oh, where do I know this from? Oh my God.
Yeah, I had a similar reaction.
And so for you, making that transition was obviously a conscious decision. Once you did that, I mean, was it hard to go back, so to speak?
No, I got a job playing bass for Steppenwolf. So I went back out on the road, touring only, no studio work with them. And I was a sideman, but it was a good job. And then I went to Hoyt Axton and played bass for him for a while.
Oh, wow.
And then in 1979, I moved to Maui. And there was a recording studio there called The Winery, and up in Kalpakalua, with an API console and an MM1000 24-track recorder.
Oh, the big refrigerator.
Yeah. And I started producing Hawaiian records. And
so,
I also...
Wait a second here. Let's back up a minute, because that's a hell of a leap. I can understand, for example, moving from Detroit to Scottsdale or Phoenix, Arizona, because, maybe you hate the weather or something like that.
Yeah.
But why suddenly did you pick Hawaii? Was it just...
I married a girl whose family lived there. And so we went there on our honeymoon, spent 2 weeks, came back, I had 8x10 pictures of Maui up on my office wall. And at one point I just said to her, I said, "What are we doing here?
Let's get the hell out of here, right?
Why don't we go get a house in Maui and just wing it?" And she was missing her family because one of her brothers lived there too. And so she said yes. And we sold everything, packed up, and moved to Maui. I took my Hammond B3.
Wow. Traveling light, eh?
Yeah. So it had anvil cases.
Of course. But now, did you have any concern? I mean, I know that it probably wasn't an issue back then, but did you have any concern about there not being necessarily a music scene the way there was in a lot of mainland cities?
Well, there is a huge Hawaiian music scene. That's the local music. There's a lot of jazz and rock bands playing in the hotels and restaurants. So it does have a scene.
But was it that way then, is what I'm curious about?
Yes, it was.
I see.
And there was George hadn't built Lahaina Sound yet.
That's George Benson.
Yes, but he showed up at the Blue Max and would sit in with whatever band was playing there. And he was real friendly to the local musicians. And when he did build his studio, I produced shows there for the big Maui hotels. They switched from live bands to pre-recorded tracks, and I produced some of those at Lahaina Sound, and had Emil Richards and Joe Percaro on one of them for the Hyatt.
Well, it sounds to me like you basically moved to Maui and adjusted very quickly.
Yes. I did a 9-year morning radio show, and there were I mixed Hawaiian and country music on my first station, and they went well together.
I can see that. Yeah.
It was ostensibly a country station, and they were struggling in the market. Their advertising sales were terrible. It was a low power FM in Makawao, Maui. And I did the morning show and was program director, and I started mixing in Hawaiian music. And within 6 months, we were #2 in the market.
So you got radio demographics in your career at that point too, then, eh?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And there were no Maui artists on record. And there was a terrific 3-piece Hawaiian group called the Part-Time Paniolos with Charlie Kahuna Nui. And they had a song, I got all emotional there. They had a song called My Island Maui, which was a local favorite, and it was huge with audiences. And I took them into the winery studio in Kalpakalua and recorded that song, and we pressed a 45. And I started playing it on the air, and so did other stations. And so Maui got their first airplay. And so I formed a Hawaiian record label called Mauis Own Records and Tapes. There were no CDs yet. And produced albums for acts that were playing in the hotels. It gave me a market for the cassettes and vinyl. The hotel gift shops would stock the albums, and the guests would see the band there and then buy the album. So it took off. It was small, but it worked.
Well, you know, what I think is fascinating here is the fact that you kind of did a whole bunch of different things at once, largely because nobody told you couldn't.
That's correct.
There was nobody saying to you, you can't be a radio DJ and a producer at the same time, and you can't record local talent because there's no scene here, or anything like that. You just kind of did it because it was there, and you created your own opportunities in a sense.
Yes, I released 26 albums over the years that I had the label. 25 of them were very profitable. One tanked because right after we recorded it, the artist quit playing and moved back to the Big Island. So I had no artist to play the music and no hotel to sell the tapes in.
So essentially you almost had your own ecosystem there. You know, you have the performance venues, you have the radio station to promote it, and you have the venue to create the content.
Yes.
Man, talk about a wide open market, huh?
It was, like I said, small but vibrant.
Well, and I think what's also interesting about that is that even though it was small, it was self-perpetuating, and so it gave you not only a good business proposition, but it gave you a stage to sort of learn things on.
You bet. I've learned all my life. I've called my career the accidental career. Opportunities would present themselves, and if it seemed right, I just took it. And even if I didn't have enough experience to really do it, I did it anyway, and I learned.
I think that is to me it's a character trait that I know a lot of us have in this industry, And I think it's more than just an entrepreneurial spirit, though I think that obviously that's a part of it. It's a
Yeah,
facet of it. But
the business wasn't as important as the art.
exactly. And I think, I'm fond of saying that a lot of times it's allowing the path to sort of illuminate as you walk along it. It's
Yes.
when I talk to a lot of students, a lot of them are coming out of school laser focused on this is what I'm going to do, and I know that this is what I want. And then they sort of discover over the years that, wow, there's a whole lot of other opportunities that just sort of come up, and connections lead to other connections, and circumstances lead to other circumstances. And I think you are talking about one of the most valuable aspects to me, which is just being open to opportunities and to connections, and to just saying, you know what, I've never done that before, but damn it, I'm going to try because I can figure it out. And, maybe I'll fall flat on my face, but I'm going to learn something.
That's what happened on my first feature film mix.
That's the next thing we're going to get into. Yeah. You obviously fell into a lot of other stuff, including film. I know that you have an extensive repertoire. Well, first of all, we should talk about some of your musical stuff a little bit more, and then we'll get into the feature film stuff. I know that you worked with both Donald Fagen and Walter Becker. You've done some you have quite a wide variety of stuff, the Hawaiian stuff. I was looking at your discography. You've got Journey, you've got Buffy St. Marie, you've got, really kind of all over the map musically.
Yes.
And I think that's another thing that to me is always fascinating, because, people tend to pigeonhole musicians as he's a metal guy, he's a jazz guy, she's a, classical, whatever it is. And I've always thought that was kind of a shame, because almost every musician I know, we love almost all kinds of music. There are very few things that I don't love, or at least entertain somehow an interest in. And that again is something that I think being flexible is really part of that. It's just like I can play any kind of music at all, and I can enjoy playing it.
Me too. I can't think of a type of music that I don't like.
Mm-hmm. And that, I think, again, it opens you up to all sorts of possibilities. I got hired to play in a band and kind of, music I had never played before. Well, gee, just sit down and learn it like you learn anything else, right?
Yes. I want to tell a story about how I met Walter and how we ended up building the studio together. In April of 1982, I was doing my morning radio show, and there was a 7:15 appointment on the log for the Pacific Whale Foundation. Earth Day in Hawaii is Whale Day. And so they have a big day-long concert in Kalama Park in Kihei. And there's Whale Day celebrations all over the island. Well, 7:12 or 7:13, I get a knock on the door. My guest is here. So I open the studio door, and there stands Walter Becker, still with his long hair. And I said, I know you. And he said, no, I only look like him. I'm here to speak for the Whales. And I said, okay. So my friend that ran the Pacific Whale Foundation had used Walter as a spokesman. He went around to the radio stations. Well, he did his spiel, and then we were done. I closed the mic, and he said, do you mind if I hang around a bit and play some records? And I said, no, I don't mind a bit. So we had a big U-shaped console with two Ampex 351 reel-to-reel recorders on one wing, the console in the middle of the U, and two Technics 1200 turntables on the right side of the wing. But underneath this U-shaped console table was room for record storage, and there were thousands of albums in 2 layers. So Walter sits on the floor and he starts handing me up records, and he goes, track 2, side B. And so I start playing the music that he's handing up to me. The owner of the station, the son of the owner of the station, who was the general manager, came in and said, what the hell's going on? The music's all weird this morning. And I pointed at Walter on the floor, and I said, that's Walter Becker from Steely Dan. He's picking the music. And he says, put him on the air. And I said, I already did. He spoke for the Whale Foundation. And I said he just wanted to pick some music and play some, some stuff. And he said, well, okay. And so Walter spent about 2 hours playing music in the studio. And a few years later, I was at a different radio studio, and he called me up and said, I want to come back in and ghost DJ. And this time it was rock and roll. So we did, and the station was cool with it. And then I had built my small Maui studio where I was with a 16-track recorder where I was producing my Hawaiian albums. And Walter came to me in 1988 with all the outtakes and alternate mixes from Steely Dan. And he said, I had a DAT recorder, one of the first ones around. And he said, I want to make a DAT for me and Walter, or for me and Donald, of these outtakes, but we're going to select them. We don't want everything. And so I taped a phone up on one of the big studio monitors so Donald could hear the songs, and had an extension, a wireless extension for Walter to talk to Donald. And we spent 6 days going through all the outtakes and making DATs. And I heard stuff that you wouldn't believe. And at the end of it, Walter said, okay, now I want you to destroy these tapes and throw them in the dumpster.
Oh.
And I didn't do it for a week. And MCA Records bounced the work order because Walter hadn't signed it. So they sent it back to me, and I called Walter from my office, which was next to the studio. And I said, I need you to sign the work order. They're not going to pay me otherwise. He says, okay. He comes into the office because he only lived 5 minutes away. And he saw the tapes were still there. And he says, no, I'm not signing it. And I said, are you sure that you want me to do this? This is really on my mind. And he says, yes, we released all the good stuff. So I took out a screwdriver and took the flanges off and got out a razor blade and cut up all the outtakes and alternate mixes of Steely Dan.
Oh, how painful was that?
It was painful. I got a bottle of tequila.
I'll bet.
And so a couple months later, he comes to my studio and he says, are you doing any business here? And I said, yeah, I'm really busy. I'm making a decent living. And he said, but this is too small to make a record. And I said, I'm doing okay. And he said, why don't we go build a real studio? Why don't you shut this down and let's go build a real studio? And I was floored. And I said, I need 60 to 90 days to finish the albums I'm working on. He said, fine. We started going out looking at property and some old buildings. We looked at an old theater in Kula and for a studio, and ended up building from scratch on 7 acres in Ulupalakua, Maui. And we did Kamakiriad and 11 tracks of whack there. I also did Willie Nelson, Buffy St. Marie, and Sinead O'Connor there, and just vocals on her. And Chris Burkett was the producer, and he came over from Chrysalis Records. And It was a wonderful studio. We had a 1-inch 45 IPS 3M digital 32 track tape recorder.
Oh,
This
wow.
is years before Pro Tools. And so I made all those records on digital tape. And we
I
had
remember some of those early digital reel-to-reels. Yeah.
Yeah, well, Gaucho was done on a 3M digital machine.
Yeah, in fact, I just had a conversation the other day with Lenise Bent, who
Oh,
also worked
Lenise
on
has
some of
been
that.
here.
Yes,
She's a good friend.
she's a good friend of mine as well, and she's got plenty of great stories from those sessions as well.
From the Asia sessions.
Yeah, yeah. So I want to kind of back up a little bit. There was something, you talk about the idea of building a studio. Now, obviously, there are technical considerations in building a studio, but there are also just environmental considerations, creating the right space, creating the right vibe and all of that, because we're talking about an environment where people need to feel comfortable to create.
And they're vulnerable.
Yes, exactly. Now, obviously, that must have been another new skill to learn, just the idea of how do we plan this out so that it is not just going to record great sounds, but is going to be conducive to creating those.
Well, we had both worked in enough studios that we figured that we knew everything there was to build one.
Uh-huh.
We soon learned the folly of our thought.
I was just going to ask you about that. Yeah.
And we hired Peter Mauer and Peter Gruneisen to design a proper studio. They had both been with Waterland with Vincent von Hoff.
Sure. I remember Vincent.
Who was a friend of mine. I loved Vincent. And
a brilliant man, definitely. Yes.
So Peter Mauer flew over, saw our slab and external walls and our ceiling laminated beam that we're going to hang the second ceiling from. And he said, that's never going to work. So he went back to LA. We stopped construction. He went back to LA and he and Peter drew up the studio, and we hired a crew of better laborers, and they put it up. It was the first Studio Bautan studio.
Ah, wow.
They didn't even call themselves that. It was Peter Mauer and Associates.
Uh-huh.
And we were in the first issue of EQ magazine.
Oh my gosh.
Mr. Bonsai interviewed us, and he said, who's the architect? And I said, I'm going to have to call you back. And I called Peter Mauer and I said, they're doing an article on us. They want to know the name of your firm. And he said, I'll call you back. So he consulted with Peter Gruneisen and came back with Studio Bautan.
Talk about thinking fast, huh?
Yeah. And they eventually built over 200 studios all around the world.
Oh, sure. And they've done some amazing studios. And I think to their credit, that's another thing that they were very, very good at, was not just the technical aspect of it, but really understanding that beyond no standing waves, beyond, having all the right connections in the right place, it really is about creating a space that one can create in and where the technology becomes as invisible as possible.
That's correct.
That's an art form. I think that in itself is really a valuable art form that I think a lot of people don't really have an appreciation for.
Yeah, I agree.
So let's segue into your longstanding relationship with David Lynch. How the heck did that come about?
Well, at the end of 1992, Walter bought me out of the Maui studio. We got busted for zoning violations.
Ooh.
So he took the studio private and bought me out. And I basically had nowhere to go I went back into radio for a short time, but it wasn't paying the bills. And my son was having a lot of trouble in school. There is a racism issue in Hawaii.
Yes.
And we are not the natives. And even though he was born and raised there, he had a lot of trouble. So I took my winnings and moved the family back to the mainland. We went to Phoenix, Arizona. I leased a 12,000 square foot concrete building and put up a studio with a video room in Phoenix. It was called Lone Cactus Records. And Peter designed the control room, and Peter Mauer came over and supervised the construction. So I built this great big studio in Phoenix, and it died. Everybody with budget went to LA.
Exactly. I was going to ask you about that because, I mean, I lived in Phoenix for a while myself, and I know that it does have a certain amount of culture going on here and there, but there was never really a huge music scene there in that sense.
That's correct. I was hoping to build it. But that was my hopes, but it wasn't well thought out.
The forces were not quite the same as they were in Maui, obviously.
Yeah. So that studio went under.
Mm-hmm.
And when it closed, I had already helped Peter Mauer with a technical package for a studio in Bangkok that they were building, the bakery. And because they got asked to supply microphones, vintage gear, wiring assistance, and things like that. And so I assisted on that job because the studio was closed. And after that was successful, Peter Mauer called me up and said, we want to start a new division of Studio Bauton, designing the technical packages for studios so we can be a turnkey studio operation. Would you like to form that division with us? And I went, here's another accidental move. I went, yes. So I moved to Los Angeles in '95, and we started Tecton Engineering. That's Tecton. And my first client was Babyface, designing a 5.1 monitoring system for him and the patch bay. So we did that. And at the time, Peter Gruneisen was designing David Lynch's home theater studio complex. And so I started meeting with David about the technical package. And he went with us. He signed a contract. So I was now in charge of the technical design of his studio, prescribing the equipment, designing the wiring loom, screen sound, isolation room, patch panels, the master patch system, all of that. And in 1997, we installed it. And David asked me to mix a Honda Passport commercial that he had shot. So of a Friday night, Angelo Badalamenti came in and David into the studio. We weren't quite through with the installation. I set up a projector on the credenza because we didn't have the digital video projector wired up yet in the projection room. He had 35 millimeter and digital. So I mixed this commercial, and then the next week we finished up the installation. And he came to me and he said, "You're the only one that knows how this studio works. I want you to run it." And I said, "Oh, David, I can't take the pay cut." And he laughed too, and because he had offered me not much money. He's very frugal. And so we talked, over a couple of days, and I came down 25% and he went up 50%. And we made a deal. And so I left the company I had founded and went to work running David's studio.
How was that for you? I mean, not just the pay cut aspect of it, but the idea that you've put time and energy into something, and then all of a sudden, again, another hairpin turn.
Yeah, well, it got me back into the studio.
Uh-huh.
And our first project was making an album called Lux Vivens for Jocelyn Montgomery. It was the music of Hildegard von Bingen from the 12th century.
Wow.
And we did cinematic soundscapes around Jocelyn's vocals. So I did all the musical arrangements, played all the synthesizers and bass and guitar on the record. David played guitar also. And we made this album, and it was released on Mammoth Records. And when we were done with it, David was having so much fun. He says, let's keep making some music. What have you got? So I had some chord progressions in my head of songs I never wrote. And we started experimenting. And we would make a percussion track and put it through the big cinema sound. And then we would play live in the tracking room to that and record 8 or 10 minutes worth, and then find the gold and edit it down. We were in Pro Tools now.
Sure.
And glorious 16-bit Pro Tools.
Mm-hmm.
And after 4 songs, David said, I think we're making an album here. So we continued on and wrote and recorded the Blue Bob album over about an 18-month period in between other projects. So he and I have an album out together. We did a concert in Paris at the Olympia Theater to introduce it for the European release.
Sounds like life kind of took a lot of strange little turns for you, huh?
Yes, indeed. And then he shot The Straight Story.
Mm-hmm.
And when it came time for post-production mixing and sound design, I said, who am I going to work with? I'd never mixed a film. I'd never mixed in 5.1. I used to mix in quad in the 70s, but so I was familiar with surround at least.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And he looked at me funny and he said, why, you are? And I said, I've never mixed a film. He said, well, it's time to learn. And so I ended up mixing The Straight Story in 5.1 surround and recording the orchestral score, which was another first for me.
I'll bet. That's another big undertaking right there.
Yeah, and I was music editor on the film. So we scored the whole movie in one 12-hour session in LA at David's studio. We had 14 string players and 3 guitar players.
Yikes.
And the guitar players were in isolation rooms so that there was no bleed, because they were very prominent. They were the lead instruments. And the night before the scoring session, I went to Sam Ash in Hollywood and bought a whole bunch of headphones and music stands, and we rented chairs. And the next day, we scored the whole movie, not to picture. We were just scoring cues. And Angelo Badalamenti stood on an anvil case of mine and conducted the orchestra. The orchestra was placed between the screen and the console in a big tracking area in the studio. And it went really well. And I was so shocked that I was able to record an orchestra without glitches.
And not just that, but I think the whole idea of more or less being put into a situation where you kind of realize, well, I have no idea what the hell I'm doing, but I'm going to do it anyway.
Yeah, I had seen string scoring sessions at United Sound Systems back in the 70s when I was a session guitarist there, because we'd have sweetening sessions for certain records and they'd bring in 8 or 10 strings.
Sure, just overdub stuff. Yeah.
And so I saw how they mic'd strings. So I had that already in my mind.
But that's only one part of the equation. I mean, there's a whole lot of other stuff going on there. And, having to learn it basically trial by fire like that is, to my mind, I mean, on the one hand, it's terrifying. On the other hand, it is exhilarating. And, that's the way I learned in my first engineering session as well. And that's the way a lot of us learn. And I think in a certain way, it's probably among the most beneficial ways to learn, because you got to get in there and get your hands dirty, right?
Yep. And then when it came time to mix the film, I had Ron Ang as the sound supervising editor, the sound editor, effects editor, and supervising sound supervisor, and Walter Spencer on dialogue cleanup, and Patrick Girardi mixing the dialogue. So I had people working with me that had each mixed over 50 films.
That helps too. Yeah. That
was really good. But it was funny. Walter jabbed me in the ribs one day early on and said, "You've got a lot of balls." And I said, "What do you mean?" And he jabbed me again. And he said, "Do you know how many years you have to sit next to a lead mixer before you ever get your hands on a fader?" And I said, "No, I have no idea." And he said, "I can't believe that you're mixing this film." And I said, "Well, I've made hundreds of records." So I had the realization that 5.1 was no different than stereo, except you have more channels to deal with. But voice is king. Dialogue has to be on top of everything.
Absolutely.
And so I mixed that way. It was my first time playing with surrounds other than the quad days, but David gave me guidance on that. It was only his second 5.1 mix. Lost Highway was his first. And he said, "I only want ambiances in the surrounds, because the action takes place on the screen and I don't want to distract people."
Sure.
And I said, fine, but he allowed me to drive a car through the theater. We had a scene in which this car approaches Alvin on his lawnmower, and it drives right across the screen. It throws dirt in Alvin's face. And I drove the car through the theater from the left front speaker to the right rear surround. And David loved it. Laughed about
it. Well, I think what really fascinates me here, John, is the way you rose to the occasion in so many of these situations that could have turned into an absolute disaster.
Yeah, I was lucky on that film.
Well, I always question people when they say that, because yes, there is a certain aspect of luck there, but I also believe that the universe hands us things sometimes.
Yes, I agree with that.
And I think being given those opportunities, yeah, you definitely are, you're walking across hot coals, but at the same time, if you're supposed to make it to the other side, I think you will. It's the universe brings us what we need. And I don't want to sound all cosmic woo-woo about it or anything, but I think to a certain extent, if you open yourself up to these opportunities, that's a big part of it right there. Because if you're terrified of something, if you're going to freeze, you're not going to do a good job. But if you just say, you know what, what the hell? The worst thing that happens here is I crash and burn. Most of the time you don't.
That's correct. And that was my career.
I can definitely relate. And I think, it's obviously paid off for you in terms of having a really diverse career and a really eclectic career.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic thing. You've done a whole lot of stuff, and I would guess that your career took you to places that were completely different from what you expected when you started out in the 60s.
Oh, you bet, because I was a guitar player and singer.
And you were going to be a rock star, and that was all there was, and that's
all there was.
Yep.
And I was lucky that I had those records out at such a young age.
Yeah, but I think also you were fortunate to run into the right opportunities at the right time, and more importantly, recognize them.
Yes.
And I think that's a fantastic thing right there. And that's a lesson that I think, regardless of how technology changes, regardless of how our industry has changed, recognizing and taking the opportunities when they arise and being willing to say, you know what, I'm going to make a hairpin right turn here or left turn there, whatever it is. That's what makes for an interesting career.
I agree. I mixed 24 feature films, 14 shorts, and over 400 records.
Wow. Yeah, I'd say you've done your time.
Yeah, 56 years in the studio was enough.
Fantastic. John Neff, thank you so much for being my guest.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure, and I have really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you. I have too.
Hey, I'm Daniel Keller. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and join us each week for Insights in Sound.